Hello again. I just got a really nice comment on my YouTube channel from someone called Michelle, who says she doesn't comment that often, but she watches every single one of my videos, which seems like a tall order. So thank you, Michelle. She has been reading stuff of mine, which is nice, really nice. But she says that she's never been a fan of science fiction, but she's curious to read one book and to see if it appeals to her as a genre. She says, I've never really tried to read science fiction before, and I'm not sure why. Maybe I didn't feel it would relate to real life. Do you have a recommendation of a book that would be the best one for me to try? I do try to read a range of fiction and non-fiction books. Thanks for your channel. It's a really good question, and it's made me want to do a video especially about this. I've hastily assembled a pile of recommendations. I think fairly good ones. It's a hard one, really. It's not hard. It's an endless question. Why do you love a genre? What would you recommend? I think it's an interesting thing to crack, isn't it? When you've been put off a genre for whatever reason in the past and think that's not for me. It's quite good when you meet somebody who knows a little bit about it. I'm not an expert in science fiction by any means, but I know enough, I think, to pick out a few books that I think people might like. I have the same problem in that I don't like the ones where they're not relatable, to use that contemporary phrase. Sometimes science fiction can be a bit like boys' own stories. There's lots of fighting and weapons and running about, at least in a certain kind of science fiction, the kind that usually ends up being filmed and representing the genre. There is, of course, much more to it, but there is that kind of slightly juvenile feeling about it still, because we summon up pictures in our heads of all the old pulp magazines and the movie posters. Science fiction is much more complex, and I think if you look into the genre, it's just as capable of giving you stories about people you can relate to, about people who are real on the page, who are confronting dilemmas and ideas stranger than most. Fiction, the best fiction, is often about people being placed under pressure and seeing how they react, and we can watch them react as readers from a safe distance. Science fiction places people under pressures that are almost impossible to imagine, strange pressures, in the way that horror does. Anyway, I've hastily grabbed up a pile of books that I think are my favourites, or at least represent a route in to this particular genre. One thing I've left off this pile, I've just realised, is the Body Snatches, something I've read just this summer that I think is an amazing book from the 50s, and I've just forgotten who wrote it. I might have to go and have a look for it, or at least look it up here. I've somehow done without this book all my life. Let's see. Can't find Jack Finney. Jack Finney wrote The Body Snatches in the mid-50s, and it's almost like one of the most influential science fiction books I can remember. A bit like H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, where you feel the impact of that book in every science fiction novel since. The interesting thing about The Body Snatches is that it's about existential dread. It's about, actually more than that, epistemological dread. The things we know, do we really know them? The people next to us, do we really know them? Are they actually who they seem to be? I would recommend that, I think. I think it's such a weird and paranoid book, But it all takes place in people's houses, in doctors' waiting rooms, in cafes, in ordinary places, in small town America. And I think that's one of the keys to making this genre real as well. I should put these in kind of order of publication, but I haven't. I'll just work through them. The pile I gathered consists of these. Daniel Keyes' Flowers for Algernon from the 1960s. This book broke my heart. I'd recommend it every time to readers of every genre. It's a book about compassion and intelligence and artificial intelligence and the business of changing the way that people think using technology. Can we bestow brilliance upon people? What happens to people when you dabble with their minds? Charlie Gordon, who's got an IQ of 68, is a floor sweeper, and they experiment on him, and he gains amazing intelligence. And so does Algen the mouse, whose experimentation preceded his. The whole thing is really heartbreaking. You watch somebody's consciousness expand in the opening chapters of this. It's brilliantly written. It's very like, thinking about it, James Joyce and The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, in the way that you watch that character grow on the page through the words he uses and narrates his life with. So that's a huge recommendation from me. I didn't read this till recent years. I was 40 when I read this, and I wish I'd read it when I was younger. Some books I read when I was much younger. When I was 15, I was obsessed with Dune, Frank Herbert. In this edition, although not this particular copy, this is a nicer copy than the one I had, which is falling apart. It smells of the mid-1980s, although it's a 60s copy. Now, this is something that doesn't take place in the cafes and kitchens and ordinary places. It's the most far-flung, exotic science fiction novel I can think of. The most colourful, these kind of acrylic impasto paintings on this particular series. I've got the first 4 of these. They're beautiful. The colourfulness of that really, to me, summons up the colourfulness of the book. It's something where a whole culture, a whole series of cultures are conjured up on the page. This is somebody who goes to town on the world building and creates this thickly atmosphered, strange, mytho-poetic, if that's a word, world for you to steep yourself in. I believe in all of it. And it's full of drama. Even though it's these huge vistas and huge concepts, we are always focused down in scenes between 2 or 3 characters who are at loggerheads and paranoid about each other and psyching each other out and usually doing terribly cruel things to each other. It goes on for a number of books, and I've read the first 4. The 4th one in recent years, and I think they do go downhill. I think the ones to read the first 3, probably the first one. But I would always recommend Dune, and I would always recommend Ray Bradbury. This is my copy of The Silver Locusts, which from 1987 I bought this. It's a 60s copy. I bought this in February 1987. We were doing it for school. I'd kind of set it for myself. I was doing an essay on this and Heart of Darkness and A Passage to India. It's Bradbury's great book about Mars, about the colonizing of Mars, composed of lots of stories that he's woven together, that he wrote over years and years. Bradbury was wonderful, I think. I've got an awful lot of books by him. And you could read him forever. He's one of the great poets of science fiction. And I was glad I discovered him so early, in my mid-teens. Look, Timeslip, 45 pence. Timeslip was the great science fiction bookshop in Newcastle by the bus station. In the 1980s, the place we bought American comics, Doctor Who fanzines, and all kinds of science fiction novels. It makes me happy to have something with that sticker still on. So, yeah, so Bradbury, and above all, I would recommend the Silver Locusts, aka the Martian Chronicles. I think it's been added to in recent years with further stories from his oeuvre, so it'd be nice to look for that with the extra stories in. But anything by Bradbury. Now, a British science fiction writer who I'm not sure how well known he is around the world. Day of the Triffids certainly is, because it was filmed several times over. But his set of novels, there's about 6 or 7, and some short story collections. John Wyndham, everything by him is very collectible, very readable, and original. Midwich Cuckoos, also filmed as The Village of the Damned. We're back in the real world again, the real world with oddness encroaching. And this is the village where everybody falls asleep one night. Alien spaceships pass overhead, and in the morning, all the women are pregnant, mysteriously, instantly, and they give birth to the creepiest children who grow up quickly and make everybody feel a bit paranoid and a bit weird. It's the most insidious invasion story of all. These are from the kind of 50s and 60s, I think, his books. And they're all worth reading, definitely. I'd begin with this one, I think, Midwich Cuckoos. It's the most relatable, as they say. But then again, so is Day of the Triffids, where the world is taken over by flesh-eating plants, and it's a question of survival. Right, just a few more. Here's something else I read when I was in my early teens. Dragonflight. You see my copies falling to pieces, this old corgi copy, by Anne McCaffrey, who wrote various series in the genre. And Dragonflight is her best series. It's a medieval world of Pern, which is beset by dragons, and the people live in castles. But they've tamed the dragons, and they use them to destroy threads which fall from the sky, which would kill them. And so the dragons burn them up. They fly out and burn these threads up. I think that's what happens. It's romantic and dramatic, and it paints the most glorious pictures in your head. I think that's what science fiction does for me. At its best, it engages your heart and sympathies. It engages your mind in these kind of mind-spinning ideas that you wouldn't get anywhere else. But it also paints these vivid and bizarre pictures in your head. That's what the genre means to me. Riverworld, another series. Philip Jose Farmer. This is To Your Scattered Bodies Go. This is such a strange series. I read this when I was about 30. There was a wonderful bookshop here in Manchester that we used to go to when we first moved here, and they had lots of vintage science fiction paperbacks for £1.50 each, according to this. And I would buy a yard of them at a time. Things that I felt I should read that I never had. And this series is one of the most peculiar, and one of the things that I'd had bookmarked in my mind that I really wanted to read. It's about the afterlife. People wake up on a strange world of mountains and a central river that goes on forever. And people wake up in the afterlife and meet famous dead people. In this one, we get Sir Richard Francis Burton, the translator of the Arabian Nights. We get Alice Hargreaves, the real-life model for Alice in Wonderland, and various others. Mark Twain, I think, comes into it. And there's aliens and the most bizarre adventures. Again, it's kind of a bit phantasmagorical and surreal. And I've read a bunch of these, and they get odder and odder as they go on. Lastly, Richard Matheson, who I think is a wonderful writer. everything I've read by him is great. This is I Am Legend, which again I read when I was about 30. It's a great science fiction novel, but it's also a horror novel. It's about a future world taken over by vampires, or vampire creatures, and the last man standing in New York, in a kind of post-apocalyptic New York, with his dog, and fending off these creatures that only come out at night. It's been filmed numerous times with Will Smith, with Vincent Price, with Charlton Heston. Different names each time. The Last Man on Earth, The Omega Man, and then I Am Legend. It's incredibly vividly written and tightly written. He also wrote for The Twilight Zone, wrote classics for The Twilight Zone. There's another novel at least by him that I loved, The Shrinking Man, perhaps. His short stories are fantastic too. So I'd recommend him every time as well, Richard Matheson. So that's my my heap today that I would recommend if I was going to go off and tell people this is where I would start in science fiction. It's not what people would normally say, perhaps. You'd get Arthur C. Clarke, Brian Aldiss, Asimov, those kind of people recommended. But these are my choices, and I think they represent a certain kind of science fiction that has a heart, that brings things back down to the domestic, to real people living in houses, but at the same time can spin off into these huge vistas that paint pictures, surreal pictures in your mind. Okay, that's me on science fiction today. Okay, goodbye. I'll see you again soon. Comments below. I want to hear your recommendations and what you make of mine. Okay, goodbye.